Today's episode is brought to you by the Breckham Group, a supply chain consulting firm built by operators and engineers, not just advisors. Their experienced team helps companies bridge the gap between strategy and execution inside distribution centers using a proven framework called Precision Supply Chain Operations. The result? Faster performance, greater efficiency, and real ROI. If you need speed, precision, and measurable results, visit breckhamgroup.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Jack Cox, and he is coming to us with 20 plus years of experience for some of the big guys you might have heard of before, like Amazon, Target, Wayfair, and he also has his own consulting business as well called Axiomata Foundational Excellence. And we're going to talk a little bit about the foundational excellence principles and concepts with him today, and a little bit about what that means and how to apply that into your operation and how he's applied that in the past as well. And we're also going to, of course, tap into a little bit of his thoughts in the operations world, because he's seen a thing or two, you could say, from his experience, definitely. So, Jack, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Kevin. I'm great. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. I'm a fan. I think your content is always really interesting, which is somewhat of a rarity these days on the socials, to actually see something that's substantive coming back that you can build on, you can learn from, and you're really good at that. So I appreciate hopefully adding to that value.
All right. Well, that's the goal on my side. So happy to hear that. Definitely. So you've spent a lot of time in operations with a lot of big players that are known for their supply chain and their logistics organizations, and well renowned for them, and kind of the example for a lot of other people, right? So tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what you're up to now as well.
Yeah. And, even before I get into the big guys, I think
Sure.
I won't go into a lot of detail on my early career, but, I think the first, several jobs I had were people hiring me to do everything but sales, right? Right. Setting up warehouses,
Sure.
managing transportation, payroll, taxes, right? And I think one of the interesting pieces of that during that time was that I'd never had a mentor who was in my domain area, right? Like I had mentors and I had people I looked up to and I learned from, but when it came to like operations and supply chain, I was always just figuring it out for myself, right? And so, during that time, I relied heavily on, reading, right? And I read a lot on lean and, the goal and theory of constraints. And I think a lot of how I think about operations today comes from me taking these frameworks, right? These philosophies of operational excellence and managing an operation, but then figuring out how to apply them myself, how to build my own playbook off of those, right? And so I think that very much is foundational to how I think. And so, when I did go to Amazon in 2010, that fit their culture really well. And it's hard to believe, but Amazon, 15 years ago was about 5% of the size it is today.
That's
right.
Wild.
It was
That's just wild to think about.
30 billion in sales, 130 to 150 billion dollar valuation, right? And the big thing that was happening when I got there was Amazon had, I don't want to say mastered, because it's Amazon is very much we can always do better culture. But the fulfillment centers were well-oiled machines. There weren't a lot of them. I think there was a dozen when I started back then. But they ran really well. They had great talent. They had a good foundational framework for how they built. But in the transportation space, it was still very much vendors paid for the freight to the door, and you handed it to UPS and FedEx on the outbound side, right? And so this was right when Amazon started to kind of disintermediate in that area. Jeff Wilke had kind of put out this mandate that on the inbound side, they were going to go from they pay freight to we pay freight, right? Taking control of that first mile. And on the outbound side, starting to manage some of the middle mile line haul movements to FedEx, SmartPost, and people like that, right? So I was actually hired as one of the first two like solely dedicated truckload managers in that space. And so they were looking for that scrappiness, that figure it out, that Amazon way of not saying this is what I've done before, but this is what I think the best path, and this is why I'm going to do it, and being very self-sufficient, right? So at Amazon, I laid out a lot of things along with others at the time that, I think are very much part of what exists today. The global line haul management system, their TMS functionality, started as an Access database with my team, and eventually was taken on by the technology teams built into the global platform. And I'm sure has been taken much further since then, right? My last couple of years there, I started working for Amazon Transportation Services, which was this middle mile, last mile space that was growing. I worked for Mike Andresano, who stood up the Amazon sort centers in a ridiculously short amount of time. And I wrote the 6-pager, the white paper that launched the Amazon trailer fleet, and really is what became the Amazon Relay program today, the small provider, short-term dedicated contract capacity model. Again, they've taken it so much further, but laid it out. So, one of the really big things for me in that period of time was this idea of how do you put these concepts out? How do you build things that are going to last and be built upon without having to be torn down? And for Amazon, at Amazon, that was very, very cultural. The Amazon leadership principles, right? Things like that were this framework. They weren't playbooks. They were a framework for thinking about that. Went to Wayfair. A little, it's building out middle mile there, furniture consolidation, cross dock. Went to Target as part of Target's digital transformation. Its launch of its stores as hub strategy, managed the last mile up to and into the beginning of the pandemic, as well as middle mile replenishments, those trailing movements from the store. And then, 5 years ago, I was approached by Silicon Valley agricultural technology company, Farmers Business Network, and they wanted to be the Amazon of ag, and they wanted to deliver to farmers, among other things that they did. And they asked me to build out a network. So this was an opportunity for me to sit down and say, okay, I'm building, this ability to deliver with Amazon speed and Amazon reliability, these heavy, often hazmat agricultural chemicals on farm across North America in as fast as one day. And that really was crystallized for me, this thinking about the foundations. How do I build something like that really quickly that's going to execute at a lot level, balance scrappiness with something that's not going to become a complete, cowboy shoot from the hip culture as it grows so fast. And that's where I started to kind of codify this idea of foundational excellence, bringing all those experiences and saying, what are the basics that I need to have, and I always need to have in mind, and that I need to instill in my teams that are going to allow us to move fast and then build something that is foundational, and as it scales, it won't break. It can grow with the company. And I left FBN just this summer. I've been doing some consulting on these concepts, right? Looking at companies that are experiencing or want to experience growth, and just looking around at their operations and applying those principles and saying these are the next steps for you. I think these are things you have to watch out for, very much a stop, start, continue kind of exercise to help them define their future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the background there and the history. And you said something really interesting there about how do I build something that will last well into the future, right? So I'm curious from your experience and being involved, like you said, when Amazon was like 5% of the size it is today, right? Which is like hard to imagine, right? Because it's such a behemoth at this point. And it continues to become even more of a behemoth like every year, right? So, how does it feel? Because I think in operations, we have a unique position in that sense, right? We have a unique position where we can put processes in place. We can put operations in place, new operations, new designs on the way that we do things within the supply chain as a whole. That, to your point, can last for a very long time and be foundational to that company. So I'm curious how does it feel knowing, the things that you did like at Amazon or the other places you worked, now looking back on that and seeing like how those companies have grown and expanded upon that? I mean, what does that feel like?
Well, look, I mean, it's cool, right? Like, I love that I see an Amazon trailer on the road, and they would have gotten there without me, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and say Amazon trailers exist because I wrote that paper.
Sure.
That was a logical kind of outcome for the direction of the business at the time. But it's still, hey, me and my team, we bought that first round of trailers. We put them on the road, right? We figured out how to power them. And so it's really cool to look at. And like anything else, you look back and you say, oh, I probably could have done this better, and I could have changed that. But to see, I'm going to overuse this word, but I think it's important. The foundations that were conceived of then, and like, this is what we are trying to accomplish. Here's the core problem we're trying to solve. Still carry on, right? Yeah. That's really the really great part about it, and I think Amazon does this so well, right? A lot of that is cultural, right? It is establishing what are the ways we as an organization want to think about solving problems. What are the behaviors that we want to see from our leaders? And I think that was a big moment for me. It was seeing kind of the power of that. Now, it took me some time after that to kind of learn how to do that. I think a lot of people leave Amazon and think that that's like a plug and play and a force of will. And it's a lot more subtle than that. But now I think that's really the most exciting thing for me. Like in leaving FBN, one of the things that made me very comfortable in leaving FBN was that I built a great team and a great culture that was going to persist with the way that we built together to think about and solve problems. That's really cool. And in some ways it's cooler than the operational process or the technology or the physical trailers, right? It's the cultural aspect. And that's the big unlock, I think, that gets me really excited and that I'm most proud of.
Yeah. That's another great point there, because I mean, you do build these teams, right? And then it's kind of interesting, and I can imagine rewarding too as well, to see like, what do they then do, right, with their time, and where do they go to, and what kind of things do they build as well? So let's talk a little bit about this concept of foundational excellence that you've kind of come up with and have been focused on in your career. And we hear operational excellence a lot, right?
Sure.
So tell us, like, what is the concept of foundational excellence, and maybe
very similar to operational. Yeah, very similar to operational excellence, right? And I'm not going to say that I think any of these concepts are novel, right? They are pieced together from my experience, so heavily influenced by lean thinking and those concepts. But it's a kind of a simplified way of sitting down and saying, is my organization built in a way that's going to allow people to develop and succeed, and ultimately succeed for our customers, right? And it starts with the customer. Right. What is it that your customers value, or what do you think they will value, and having a firm grasp of what that is? Like that, I think that's where you have to start. Taking that, one step into, to the next step is that every individual in your organization should understand, it comes a very, kind of primal lean principle. Every person should understand how they add value to that customer value, right? What is their place in the value chain? How do they add to it? How do they measure it? And this is an area that I think a lot of companies in general struggle with, and a lot of startups or scrappy environments. Everybody does everything. We all pitch in. That's a great kind of cultural model of, hey, we help when we need to help. But I firmly believe when there's no owner, nobody owns it. Right. So make sure that your people know, hey, what I'm accountable for, not for outcomes. Right. And this is a big piece too. Not for, I don't own on time to the customer. That's an outcome. I own some input metric along the value chain that will eventually lead to being on time for the customer. Right. And I think that's one of the really core foundational pieces that I've seen in the best organizations is people know what their value is. And they can self-manage it, right? They have the right metrics in place, the right, pokeyokes if necessary in place to keep them kind of focused on that.
Yeah, for that, like obviously we talk about the warehouse on this podcast, right? And operations specifically. I mean, like how do you, like what's an example of that for someone that is like, say, a picker or a packer? Like how do you define like their value for them?
Yeah, well, and I think those are actually some of the easier ways, I think, to define that, right? As a picker, the value you are adding is picking the correct items, right? Okay. At a productivity rate for an SLA expectation relative to shipping. I have to pick so many units by this time, this quickly to meet this time so that it can continue down the chain, get in a box, be picked up by a carrier and make transit to the customer. So I think this often boils down to kind of a productivity metric, right? And saying how many units per hour do you pick and looking at travel time and doing these very, again, fundamental kind of lean exercises. I think that reinforcing that, right, with people, this isn't just and I think this is part of being kind of an accountable but blameless culture is people tend to get lost in the metric, right? And tend to, I think, negatively reinforce hey, it's the productivity that matters. And that's obviously with good intent. But what you want to be really doing is reminding people why it's important. Right? Remind how that connects downstream. Because if you don't, what often happens is you run into siloed metrics, right? And people start to micromanage their piece of the chain to that metric that's been defined as the value. And it may have negative impacts, right, downstream, upstream. And I've seen that over and over again, especially in large organizations. It's not just the measurement of the person in their role in contributing value. It's that they understand it, right? And that the managers understand it and are managing improvement in it as a collective exercise, not a you need to do better exercise, but how do we do this better to meet the goals for the customer? It's a hard line to walk, right? And I don't think it's one that's really easily defined. And that's a big piece of this concept of foundational excellence. It's not a playbook. Right. Sure. It's very much I call it a philosophy, right? Like it is very much just like, hey, what are these things that we should always keep in mind when we're talking to people and building out and thinking about what we do next? But a big piece is, you're breaking down to those individual milestones, those individual links in the value chain and measuring those inputs and that performance without losing sight of the downstream, the upstream, and ultimately the customer.
Yeah. And I think that answers it well, because I think, where my head goes there in that situation is oftentimes, I guess unfortunately, like, people at the lowest level on the floor are looked at as, just a number in a sense. And they then also feel like that as well. Like, I'm just putting stuff in a box. Like I'm not really adding value here. So it's like, how do you define that for them? And then I think to your point, like, how do you continue to reinforce that, right? So that they understand that and they feel like they're contributing value, even though they may not, because they may not understand it, like coming in at the full picture.
Yeah, and it's one of the steps down the line a little bit, but that grassroots empowerment, that's where the best innovation comes from, right? I tell people all the time, right? Like when you're doing a task and you're saying to yourself, this really sucks, right? This should be easier. You have the best perspective on that, right? And you need to voice that. And sometimes there's reasons, right? And it could be downstream, upstream. It sucks for you, but the overall benefit is great. But like that's where real continuous improvement happens is from the ground up. And empowering individuals in the team to think about their tasks in that way is where it starts. And I think Amazon, I imagine it still does. I can't at that scale. I'm sure it's very difficult to maintain, but that was one of the things that Amazon did really, really well. That's why the FCs so quickly over a period of 10 years became some of the best fulfillment operations or just operations in general, right, in the world, was that grassroots innovation. So the next one, again, this isn't a new concept, right? And people call it different things, but so you've got people, understand the best value to the customer. You understand and have defined kind of roles and accountabilities, and now people can understand where they add value. Plan, do, check, act, right? Concept been around a very long time now,
Yeah.
but and you can go into DMAIC. I like the simplicity of plan, do, check, act. Have a plan, execute the plan, measure how you did, adjust, and build that cycle and that routines into everything. And it doesn't mean that it's really like, again, people want to make things very rigid, right? And they want to get into these, they want to be like kind of fully mature right away. And your plan, do, check, act doesn't need to start that way, right? Your plan, you might not have a lot of data to create a plan, but build assumptions and then track it, right? But build these cycles of planning, execution, action, follow up into everything at different time horizons, right? You can do that within a day, right? A stand-up scrum at the beginning of a shift is your plan, right? Hopefully you're getting some data to lead that stand-up in terms of what we need to accomplish today, right? But then you execute. Ideally, the check is actually happening within the execution. I think that's the shining city on the hill, is that while you're doing it, you're able to actually check and manage and adjust. But, that takes time. It takes data. But, at least that you're then saying, okay, we had a plan, we executed the plan. How do we change it? And just keep that going. That is, there's a reason it's been around for a while. It works, right? And you have to be diligent in it, but you also have to start where the company is. I think I've seen a lot of ex-Amazon leaders, high profile leaders, go to environments, right, where someone kind of wanted that Amazon playbook. And I think and I probably have done the same. They made the mistake of thinking of the tools as where they want to start in developing that culture, when it's like, hey, that company might not be ready. They might not have the data availability or the culture to write a 6-pager. So start where they are, but think about what you're trying to accomplish. Plan, do, check, act, even in a really basic way, and then just make it better.
Interesting. And that's an interesting point there too, about, going from, and I had a conversation recently with somebody else about this too, who came from an Amazon environment and went to like more of a smaller business type of operation environment, and suddenly realized like, whoa, like it's totally different. Right. And so how do you recognize that, I guess, in the operation, like where they are in this kind of, I guess, sophistication journey in a sense? Like, how do you recognize, like, okay, we can implement this kind of tool, or we're not ready yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I do, either on an engagement or when I enter a new company the first time, is beyond talking to people, right? Always a good start, just to have conversations. Show me your metrics. What do you use? And what are you reviewing? When I got to FBN, I asked that question. I got this like 50-page printout of open orders, some of which were like 6 months old. Told me a lot about where they were. Right?
Interesting.
And so, I think that'll tell you a lot. Is what are they using to measure the business? Are they measuring inputs? Are they at least measuring the right outputs? Is it accurate? I think both at Amazon and Target. This is really interesting to me. What I did at both companies was I came in, asked, hey, how do we measure truckload performance? And of course, on time was the answer. In both those places, when I got there for the first time, truckload defect rates, truckload performance, and then as a result, on time was measured by, if someone reported the truck late, then it's a defect. Everything else is assumed to be on time. Right.
Interesting.
Right.
Okay.
So the first thing I did in both those environments was completely break. Right. They look like if you were to do a time series on time performance as reported, it went from like 99 to like 75.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but that, again, how are they tracking the right things? How are they doing it? The idea, not just an Amazon idea, but the idea of input metrics, right? Outcomes matter to the customer. They matter to the business, but you don't manage outcomes. You manage inputs. My favorite example on that is in the on-time truckload space, right? You want to know, did it show up on time? That's the outcome. I want to know, did the carrier show up on time? Did we release them on time? Did they make transit in the expected amount of time?
Yeah.
If I manage all of those things, the on-time outcome, it'll take care of itself, right? And so, where are they in that journey? And then starting to build that out if they don't have that. If they don't have routines where they're covering this, put those in. Hey, my first few WBRs at quite a few companies have just been, bring me what you have. Just talk about the business, right? we might not have any data yet, but start just bringing what you have, and then we'll work on building that out to what we need.
That's interesting, and I'm curious because you said something interesting there, like focusing on the input metrics versus like the output metric in itself, and it made me think of this conversation I had last week, actually, where somebody was visiting an operation. They're going through and they're looking at the metrics, and it was like the best day ever from a metric perspective they had, and they asked a question like, well, why was this the best day? Like, what happened? And the operations leader had no idea.
What did we do?
Yeah,
did we do something right?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how, I mean, how do you kind of, because I think that's one of the challenges, right? Like we look at like it's on time percentage, it's inventory accuracy, or it's order accuracy, things like that. I mean, how do you go from looking at those kind of, I guess, output metrics, as you're saying, to shifting to understanding like the input metrics, or even what those input metrics should be to figure out where you actually have issues, or where you're excelling, or just that performance that's actually happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, even the conversation you just talked about, that's a good start, right? Hey, we had a great week. Did we do anything different?
Yeah.
Right. Even if we don't have the metrics, did we do something differently, or did, like what? Yeah. Starting anecdotally is fine. Right. Especially when you're trying to identify what you want to measure. I think the process of defining input metrics and KPIs in general is one of continuous improvement and experimentation. Sometimes I might say, hey, I want to look at this data and see if it starts to mean, but you know what, if we're going to our WBR and that piece of data is not leading to any discussions, any observations, any actions, it's probably not the right one, right? So toss it, right? Let's not spend, or we're not presenting it the right way. So I think there's a lot of just trial and error, in operations. A lot of those are pretty well defined, right? I think that's inside a warehouse, and I think it's one of the advantages of it. I think that's very much core to how Amazon thinks about the world is, hey, in this really controlled environment, we can really capture that data, define it. It gets a little more nebulous when you get outside the four walls, right? But I think it's experimentation, saying, what are we missing? How would we like to measure it? And do we have that data? Can we present it in a way that makes sense? And again, you can't lose sight that the outcomes are important. Right, the enterprise is going to care about the outcomes, right? Whether it's your costs or you're on time and your customer NPS, whatever it might be. But you have to be able to bridge back to why those things changed over time. I think you see that in a lot of even just financial reporting, where companies go from our costs were up, and then they speculate as to why, as opposed to our costs are up because these were the assumptions we built into this number, and these are the ones that ended up being different.
So from a foundational excellence perspective, so we have like understanding and defining the value, right? And then we have understanding the roles and responsibilities, right, that create that value in a sense. And then the plan, do, check, act. And then how do we, because we talked a little bit about how to recognize, I guess, where you are essentially to implement that plan, do, check, act. And so how do we take it to the next level once we've
I think the next one, and I think this is the most controversial in small company environments, right?
Okay, sure.
Which is standard work, right? Process.
Right. Yes.
Right. Standard work and process create reliability, right? They create consistency. And most importantly, they create kind of transactional integrity in your data, right? And I think a lot of times, a lot of companies that grew up or have started in these scrappy, shoot from the hip environments say, well, we don't have the time to do standard work and process. And when I talk about standard work and process, I'm not talking about written work instructions, right? Those have their place, but I'm talking about what are the key things we need, particularly from that transactional integrity, that data integrity standpoint. What are the key things that need to happen to make sure we're understanding what's happening in the business, right? Safety is often a good place to start this, right? Because people kind of intrinsically understand, hey, if you're going to, 3 points of contact, right? Like if you're going to climb on a ladder and work at heights, work at heights gets into harnesses and things, but let's just say you climb on a stepladder to load a truck. 3 points of contact, right? We do that because it's more safe, and we want to do that every time because the consistency of doing that is going to be a safer environment. Same concept, right, in your other processes. So at FBN, we had to stand up. We stood up, about 24 buildings across North America in a year and a half, right? Really fast. Had to move quickly.
That's fast, yeah.
And so I had to kind of we laid out here are the rules you just do not break, right? So we worked in a NetSuite environment. NetSuite uses an object called an item fulfillment, right? So if you don't get that item fulfillment that says, that is the transaction in the system to fulfill an order, you do not fulfill that order. Hey, if a customer shows up and says, hey, I just called 10 minutes ago and placed this order, give it to me. Get on the phone with customer experience, customer support to get that IF as fast as possible for the customer, but do not let that order leave the building without the item fulfillment, right? Just that is a don't break it rule, right? And then we build on that. And so really when you're looking at an operation, and you're looking across it, if any activity is happening where the data that tracks that activity is entered later or is missing entirely, focus on your process and focus on your technology to capture that. You want your systems to be reflecting things as they happen. You don't want to be going back at the end of the day. A lot of when we went, one of our most challenging expansions was in Australia, and much different culturally in a lot of ways within operations in Australia. And they were like, oh, well, we fulfilled all our orders. And then at the end of the day, we go back with our stack of papers and we ship them all, right? And a lot of people kind of do this. I don't want that. I want you to mark it as it ships, right? I want to maintain that data trail, the transactional integrity, and process is a big piece of that. Now, the key and the problem with too much standard work and too much processes, right? You don't want to become a bureaucracy.
Sure.
You don't want to be rigid all the time, right? So you've got to combine that with this continuous improvement mindset. When can you be flexible? When can people take the rigid standard work and say, I think there's a better way to do this? And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If people understand their place in the value chain and how to measure it and are able to say, when I do this, it sucks, it takes too much time or whatever, you need to find a way to encourage that in the business. And so controlled continuous improvement, welcome ideas anytime, any shape, any form, but then how you implement them, how you experiment with them, do that in a controlled environment, right? It's not, hey, I think this is better, so I'm just going to start doing it. It's, I think this way is better. How do I measure it? How do I do that in a way that we can really understand? And that's, again, a really deep cultural element. But the balancing those two things are the trick, right? I standard work and process, again, consistency, reliability, transactional integrity, but balancing that with, hey, that doesn't mean this is the only way to do it. It's just we're not gonna shoot from the hip. And again, in a new culture, it feels like it takes too much time, but it doesn't. It's like rework is expensive, right? And defects are expensive, and accidents are tragic and expensive.
Sure.
So like, again, doing it right and doing it in this way is really critical to put into your culture very early.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting too. I mean, kind of those foundational components that you talked about, and then leading up to allowing that culture of innovation, continuous improvement, being able to build on these processes, because you're like, okay, this stuff is solid now. Like, this is gonna run like a well-oiled machine most of the time, hopefully, right? But that's gonna allow you to free up more time to think about, like, oh, well, how can we do this differently, or how can we add more value here, or actually this is not adding value at all. So like, let's take this out of the process and make those changes and shifts, right?
And you've probably heard in sports and in music, right? Slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? It's similar, I think, conceptually to this idea of process and standard work, and it doesn't have to be slow, right? In fact, it's going to make you go faster if you put in. I think one of the things I still remember very clearly when I was at Amazon, first couple times an Amazon building shipped 1 million orders in a day.
Sure.
And it would happen during peak. And it was often like a concerted effort to make it happen. Like, it wasn't going to happen naturally, but it was kind of, okay, let's steer volume to this building, and they've got a plan, and it's going to be a bit of chaos within management. They get it. But then, like, within like 2 years of that first building, And this was engineering and process and everything else.
Yeah.
But I remember Dave Clark said, I went to visit this building. They were doing like 1 million orders every single day. And he's like, it just felt like business as usual, right? It used to feel like this big effort that everybody had to concentrate on to make this happen. But, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Eventually you get to the point where it just works. And that's the scaling piece, right? That's where it's foundational.
Yeah, that's a great example there too, as well. And so I want to end this on. I'm curious. I think it takes time for people to think in this way, and for people to shift their mindset a little bit to be able to recognize some of these things that you're talking about. And I think a lot of people start out in operations kind of as you said you did, right? They they just got handed this assignment, like, oh, make this happen, do all these things except for sales, right? Like you said. And they're trying to figure it out. So I'm curious from your perspective, like early in your career, when was kind of a moment maybe that stands out to you of when you started to like open up this operations like third eye in a sense, right? Where you're seeing like, oh, like if we standardize this, or if we identify this waste, or we look at this metric, like this, it's going to be huge, right? So tell us a little bit about that as maybe some inspiration for others out there.
Yeah, well, and look, I will self-describe myself as a reformed kind of cowboy shoot from the hip, right? Like that was my early career.
Yeah.
I think some of the seeds got planted with me reading about lean, right? But it's particularly when it came to like standard work and process, and I still have that. Like when I talk about like written work instructions and things like that. I still don't believe that like, hey, if you're going to do lean, you have to have an A4, right? Like if you're not doing an A4 layout, then it's not lean. Like I don't think that way. But I think Amazon was really where I started to realize, hey, there is a way to apply these principles culturally instead of through rigidity that really, really works well. And then, seeing, post Amazon, seeing kind of the opposite, right? Seeing companies try to introduce operational excellence that was just kind of endless bureaucracy, as opposed to more of this philosophical framework of operational excellence, right? Again, or seeing lean implementations that are just so rigid in their approach, like they just walked out of a Toyota plant and they want to bring that and plug that in. Again, those are the tools, right? But Amazon started it seeing post Amazon with that third eye, as you put it, and saying, oh my gosh, what's missing here is not a 6-pager, right? It's something else. It's cultural. Sure. It's these underlying ideas that have been built on. I think that was really the moment, or not even the moment, but that was the evolution for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to hear that and kind of, when people start to shift that thinking and see like other things that are now possible potentially, and where can we get to? And I think your example of like, it was like pushing everything, trying to get this 1 million shipments in a day number. And then a couple of years later, it's like, oh, that's a normal day for us right now at this point. So it builds upon each other. So it really insightful conversation with you here, Jack, today, and really appreciate you kind of sharing from your personal experience and expertise and talking about this framework and things to implement to be able to build that operation to a better level and a more sophisticated level that's going to allow for that more kind of open-minded thinking and innovation and continuous improvement, which is going to take you to that next level. So really appreciate you sharing with us. If people are interested in getting in touch with you or talking more about this, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I'm active on LinkedIn. You feel free to reach out to me there. And look, I love talking shop. Probably not the best like consultant business plan, but I just like talking about stuff and giving people advice, right? Or banging things around. So, so you can reach out to me there. You can also reach out to me at Axiomata@jackcox.org, which is AXIOMATA jackcox.org, so JCKCOX.org. You can get me there too. But like I said, I'm active on LinkedIn. I tend to reply to people, and I love to talk about this stuff, or I love to be challenged. Right? If you think any of this is garbage, let's have it out. Let's talk about it.
Definitely. And I can attest to, he does reply on LinkedIn. He replied to me, and now he's on the podcast. So he definitely answers, right? So, Jack, appreciate you coming on the show. And we'll definitely put all that information for you at thenewwarehouse.com, as well as in the show notes. And thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.